Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, a house divided will fall. We tell you that the previous speaker talks about expediency and the need to be able to enact the democratic process, but we think that it's essentially an oversimplification of how all of these things work. We have to understand the complex and diverse reality of trying to hold someone accountable who is seeking in power simply because it's a very long out and drawn out process. And sure, we agree that impeachment and other methods take long as well. But more than that, ladies and gentlemen, it's about understanding and creating an image of solidarity amidst an era of conflict. The very fact that, for instance, Donald Trump, until now, hasn't necessarily been convicted is proof as to how controversial and how ultimately challenging these things particularly are, and the nature of these things is that it does more harm than good, especially to people who are actually looking at that country and understanding what's happening. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a policy debate about whether or not these incumbent or currently sitting presidents in a democracy should have criminal immunity, and we think status quo should prevail. Aside from impeachment, there are other methods in which we can hold them accountable, particularly after they've seated already. We think that this can be done in one of two ways. One, through a domestic court, or two, if severe and if fitting, then we're going to hold them accountable in the ICC and get the international community involved as well. Now, opening government might tell us, well, that's going to take long, it's not going to be fresh anymore, and ultimately, the things that they're doing, they might already be able to do while they're currently sitting in power. But we have to understand, ladies and gentlemen, that there's right now a contradictory stance that that person sitting is going to face. Meaning, as a president or someone in power, they have a responsibility to be able to genuflect to their taxpayers and people who voted them into power, and actually do a good job of being the head of the executive branch, being able to make sure that things are working out, be able to hold the legislative and judicial power. But the point in which you try to undermine that particular legitimacy, regardless if they're guilty or not guilty, puts a certain strain on him and his administration. That sort of pulls them in diametrically opposed situations where now they have this conflict of interest between trying to do what's good for their country and at the same time trying to preserve their legacy and defend themselves and save face. And that problem is ultimately a problem because we have a scarcity of resources in terms of their time, in terms of their attention, in terms of the political capacity of people to understand complex realities. That's why in America, when you see these things happening out, it furthers the divide between both sides of the house. People start making speculations and accusations already, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is dangerous and ultimately leads to a more complicated process. I'll take it later. Now, what is my case on the rebuttal will be integrated. My first case is about talking to you about why the nature of criminal immunity is important to look at and how its divisive nature, particularly in the conflict of interest I characterized, is particularly harmful. Firstly, we have to understand that the priority of that person is that they have to be able to take care of the taxpayers and the people who voted them into power, therefore carrying out a proper democracy. But if him and his current administration get muddled up in this particular drawn-out affair of trying to take him down and hold him accountable, it ultimately robs them the capacity to be able to focus on those particular things, which means they're more likely to enact nepotism and use whatever means that they have and resources to be able to protect their legacy and protect themselves, something which isn't an efficient use of resources because we rather have those directly go to the people. And that's particularly important because these people, especially at the time in which the currently sitting administration, have to be able to be there. But yeah, sure.
Would you not consider that Donald Trump's high connection with Russia a national security issue that should be actually criminally liable?
Yeah, but here's the problem. The moment opposition parties start to coalesce and try to take him down, you then reveal your hand as to what you're doing. Which is why we think it's better if you actually hold them accountable and build a case after the fact, and actually give it to the domestic court or give it to the international court, as opposed to doing it now, wherein ultimately everyone goes very defensive mode, particularly these international stakeholders and particularly Trump. So the point in which you try to hold them accountable right away, that's where you have a lot of speculation and defensiveness on his sake from people involved, and ultimately that does more harm than good because everyone has more important things to worry about. We're not saying we're not going to hold them accountable for the things they do. This is a debate about the timeline of which we rather do it after as opposed to doing it now in terms of the priorities people have to meddle with. Now, what else do we get coming from opening government? They told us how, well, the VP can sit and take into place and all of these particular things. But we think the problem with that happening is that there might be a conflict of interest as well between the priorities of the VP and the priorities in the current administration is trying to do and what the people want. So ultimately, you create a lot of controversy, a lot of furor between these particular people, and it's ultimately just not as effective. We rather allocate resources elsewhere, and that's ultimately going to be better. Now, he talked about how, well, they can still govern if we hold them accountable, they can still be able to do it. We tell you no, we reject that premise, and we think that even if they're going to be able to do it, their reputation has already been damaged. And the nature of media to speculate, the nature of people to go back to bipartisan politics, is precisely what creates a further divide between Democrats and Republicans, and people making dangerous, pejorative assumptions about Trump just because he's on the spotlight now. And ultimately, that's a bad idea. Because rather than being one America, you become an even more divided America, people who are pro-Trump and anti-Trump, and that's ultimately not productive. Now, why is impeachment better? We think that impeachment after the fact, or after it is better, because opposition parties and groups are better to be able to rally together and build a better case against them. They have time on their side to be able to make sure that they have their facts straight, as opposed to perpetuating misleading headlines and ultimately making speculations, because we have to understand the nature of the media involved here is likely to be very speculative. People who are pro-Trump are going to continue being super pro-Trump, people anti-Trump will continue being super anti-Trump, and that's particularly harmful at the point in which we need to be solid, at the point in which we need to be united. So for all of these reasons, we think the status quo is better, and we rather hold them accountable after the fact and ultimately create a more solidified chance to actually take them out and hold them accountable. For all these reasons, the motion should fall.
I think you need